In the turbulent dawn of the 20th century, Spain was a nation trembling on the edge of chaos. Political tensions rippled across its cities and villages like cracks in fragile glass. It was into this atmosphere of unrest that Juan Pujol García was born in 1912. A child of ordinary means who would one day become one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of espionage. His journey was not the typical tale of a trained soldier or a lifelong spy. Instead, it was the story of an ordinary man who, through courage, cunning, and an unshakable sense of justice, would help change the course of World War II. Growing up in a country deeply divided by ideology, Juan witnessed firsthand the bitterness of civil strife. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, families, neighbors, and friends found themselves suddenly on opposite sides. Juan, like many Spaniards of his generation, was swept up by events beyond his control. He served on both the Republican and nationalist sides not out of loyalty to either cause, but because survival demanded it. What he saw on both fronts would leave an indelible mark on his soul. The brutal consequences of extremist politics, the suffering of civilians, and the way hatred could devour an entire nation. These experiences forged in Juan a profound and lasting conviction. He would never again bow to the forces of tyranny. Totalitarian ideologies, whether draped in the rhetoric of left or right, inspired him only revulsion. He had seen too many innocent lives lost, too many promises of glory that led only to ruin. As the 1930s gave way to the storm clouds of World War II, Juan watched with mounting alarm as Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime expanded across Europe, threatening to drag the entire world into darkness. For Juan, standing aside was no longer an option. But how could one man, untrained and unarmed, strike back at such overwhelming power? That question would ignite the boldest chapter of his life. Juan decided that if governments and armies would not immediately accept his help, he would find his own way to fight back. He would use his wits, his talent for deception, and his deep understanding of human nature to undermine the very machinery of Nazi Germany. It was a gamble as dangerous as it was audacious, one that would ultimately make him one of the most effective double agents of the Second World War. This is the remarkable story of a man who proved that courage does not always come with a uniform, and that a single individual, armed with determination and cleverness, can reshape history. If you are fascinated by hidden heroes and untold stories of World War II, you are in the right place. Join us as we follow the astonishing journey of Juan Pujol García, known to history by the codename Garbo. Before we dive deeper into his daring life of espionage, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future stories from the shadowy world of wartime intelligence. Your support helps us uncover more incredible true tales from history's most dramatic moments. As Europe descended into the darkness of war, the scars of Juan Pujol García's youth began to burn anew. He had witnessed firsthand how political fanaticism could shatter families and consume nations. And now, from the heart of Spain, he watched the march of Adolf Hitler's armies with a growing sense of alarm that turned quickly to outrage. One country after another fell before the relentless expansion of Nazi power: Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, and each victory sent a chill through those who understood the cost of unchecked tyranny. Juan, still carrying the memories of the Spanish Civil War's devastation, recognized the same seeds of oppression taking root across the continent. For him, the thought of another generation suffering under a regime built on fear and brutality was unbearable. Unlike many who simply grumbled in private or resigned themselves to the tide of history, Juan felt an almost stubborn calling to act. He was not a soldier, nor a politician, nor a man of wealth or influence. Yet he believed that even a single individual could stand in the path of evil. His sense of moral duty was sharpened by the lessons of his past. He had seen how quickly people could be deceived by the promises of extremists, and how easily the machinery of war could turn neighbor against neighbor. That clarity gave him no peace. It demanded action. To remain silent while a force as malignant as Nazism spread across Europe would be, to his mind, a betrayal of everything he had learned in the crucible of civil conflict. Juan's first thought was simple and direct: he would offer his services to the Allies. Great Britain stood defiant as the last major power in Europe, refusing to bow to Hitler. It seemed natural to him that a man who despised tyranny would find an ally in a nation fighting for freedom. Yet when he approached British officials with his proposal to serve, he encountered an unexpected wall of skepticism. He was not a trained operative, had no background in espionage or military strategy, and came from a country that was, at least officially, neutral in the war. To British intelligence officers, Juan Pujol García must have seemed like an overzealous civilian whose passion far outstripped his usefulness. They politely but firmly turned him away. For many people, such rejection might have been the end of the story. But Juan's character had been forged in the harsh lessons of survival during the Spanish Civil War. He understood that perseverance often mattered more than credentials. Instead of abandoning his plan, he began to think creatively, his mind turning to a dangerous but brilliant alternative. If Britain would not recruit him, he would create a path of his own, one that would force them to recognize his value. He conceived a plan as daring as any in the annals of espionage. He would make himself indispensable by becoming the very thing the Nazis sought most. And then he would turn that position into a weapon for the Allies. Juan approached the German embassy in Madrid, presenting himself as a man sympathetic to their cause. He spoke carefully, masking the burning hatred he felt for the ideology they represented. The Germans, eager for information about Britain and convinced of their own cleverness, welcomed what they thought was a willing recruit. They gave him the codename Arable, believing they had found a loyal agent ready to gather intelligence from inside enemy territory. They had no idea that the quiet, unassuming Spaniard before them was already envisioning a far greater game. With no formal training and no connections inside Britain, Juan faced an almost impossible challenge. He had to convince the Germans that he was supplying them with authentic intelligence while secretly laying the groundwork to help the Allies. From Lisbon, where he relocated to be closer to the action, he began crafting an elaborate web of deception. He invented an entire network of imaginary sub-agents scattered across the United Kingdom. Each of these fictitious characters had their own background, habits, and methods of gathering information. Juan painstakingly wrote detailed reports, blending scraps of publicly available news with invented details, so convincing that his German handlers believed every word. This audacious scheme did more than simply fool the Nazis. It set the stage for one of the most remarkable episodes of double-dealing in modern history. The very rejection that might have discouraged another man became the spark for Juan's greatest triumph. By turning the Germans' own ambitions against them, he was not only positioning himself as a valuable asset to British intelligence, he was also shaping the battlefield of World War II in ways that neither side yet fully understood. His quiet determination, born from the chaos of civil war and sharpened by moral outrage, was about to alter the balance of power in the largest conflict the world had ever seen. Juan's plan to fight the Nazi regime took on a life of its own when his carefully measured boldness led him to the very heart of enemy operations. Having been dismissed by the British and unwilling to accept defeat, he realized that the only way to force the Allies to see his worth was to prove himself in the most dangerous way imaginable. The thought alone would have terrified many. But for Juan, who had already survived the chaos of Spain's civil conflict and witnessed the cruelty of unchecked ideology, fear had become a companion he knew how to tame. He approached the German embassy in Madrid with the calm precision of a man who had spent years watching how extremism lured followers. To them, He appeared to be a man ready to embrace the rising power of Nazi Germany, a potential ally in their quest for intelligence on Britain. Beneath the polite nods and measured words, however, lay an entirely different truth. He was already plotting their deception. His performance required more than a casual act. Juan understood that to win their confidence, he had to embody the character of a committed sympathizer, someone whose resentment of Britain's influence and admiration for Germany's apparent strength rang true. Every gesture, every inflection of his voice, every carefully chosen phrase had to carry the weight of authenticity. He wove a story about his supposed loyalty to the Nazi cause, presenting himself as a Spaniard eager to aid the Reich in its mission to reshape Europe. The German officials, flattered by what they believed was a willing volunteer and eager to expand their network of informants, found his story persuasive. In their eyes, Juan Pujol García was no mere enthusiast. He was a man with both access and determination, a figure worth cultivating. They offered him the chance to become a spy for Germany and gave him the codename Arable. To the Germans, the name represented a new asset in their intelligence network, someone who could slip unnoticed into British society and report on military movements and political moods. To Juan, however, that name was something far more powerful. It was the key to a grand deception that would eventually help shape the outcome of the war, accepting their trust without hesitation. He knew that every word he spoke from that moment on would have to be part of a careful balancing act. He must feed them information convincing enough to build their confidence, while secretly ensuring that nothing he shared would harm the allies he hoped to serve. It was a dangerous game with no guarantee of success. He had no training in espionage, no established network in Britain, and no official support from the Allies. Yet his ability to observe human behavior, sharpened by the bitter lessons of civil war, gave him an instinct for what his adversaries wanted to hear. He began crafting reports drawn from publicly available sources, newspapers, magazines, and radio broadcasts, then dressed them with plausible details and strategic misinformation. His messages suggested that he had already established a circle of informants inside the United Kingdom, an invisible team of sub-agents who passed him scraps of intelligence. The Germans, eager for every possible insight into Britain's defences, accepted his words as genuine. They never suspected that the agents in his reports were as fictional as a character in a novel. Juan's success depended on patience as much as daring. He understood that credibility was not built overnight. He carefully calibrated his dispatches so that they contained enough accuracy to be useful without revealing anything that could harm the Allies. At times he even included small, seemingly trivial details that, when later confirmed by unrelated events, made him appear uncannily well informed. Each message strengthened his position in the eyes of his German handlers, drawing them further into the web he spun. As they praised their new agent, they believed they had found a devoted servant of the Reich. In reality, they had embraced a man who was quietly preparing to betray them for a higher cause. With every secret meeting and every coded exchange, Juan's double life grew more complex. The danger was constant. A single slip of the tongue, an inconsistency in his reports, or a chance encounter with someone who knew his true intentions could have led to exposure and certain death. Yet he moved through this treacherous landscape with a calm that belied the stakes. His years of witnessing the destruction of ideology had hardened him. His commitment to undermining tyranny gave him a purpose that left no room for doubt. A rebel, the name bestowed upon him by the very enemy he sought to mislead, became both his disguise and his weapon. This daring infiltration would eventually catch the attention of British intelligence and open the door to an alliance that would transform him into one of the most extraordinary double agents of the war. But in these early days, before the world knew him as Garbo, Juan Pujol García was a lone player on the grand stage of World War II, walking a razor's edge between discovery and success. His decision to trick the German embassy was not merely an act of personal bravery. It was the opening move in a sophisticated game of deception that would confuse the Nazi war machine and help tilt the balance of history toward freedom. From the moment the Germans welcomed him as their Agent Garbo, Juan Pujol García understood that his survival and his success depended on weaving a lie so intricate that it would outgrow the truth itself. After gaining their confidence in Madrid, he shifted his operations to Lisbon, a city buzzing with wartime intrigue and the quiet tension of a neutral capital where spies from every corner of Europe rubbed shoulders in cafes and hotel lobbies. Lisbon was the perfect stage for the next act of his deception. The creation of an intelligence network that existed only in his imagination yet become, for the German High Command, a source of information so valuable that it shaped their strategy. For John, every detail he invented was both a shield and a weapon, and the stakes were as high as the war itself. Lisbon offered him the distance and the freedom to construct his grand illusion. He carefully built the persona of a man who had already infiltrated Britain, spinning stories about journeys across the English Channel and secret meetings in smoky back rooms. With patient precision, he gave life to an army of invisible helpers, sub-agents who would gather intelligence for him and pass it along to his German handlers. Each of these fictional characters had a name, a profession, a personality, and a reason to risk everything for the Nazi cause. John described their movements with such vivid detail that even seasoned intelligence officers in Berlin never questioned their existence. He gave them families and habits, quirks and flaws, because he understood that the smallest touches of humanity made even the wildest stories believable. His reports to the Germans were a masterclass in controlled misinformation. He read British newspapers and listened to broadcasts, harvesting fragments of real events and dressing them in the fabric of his elaborate fiction. A ship's departure from a port, a rumor from a factory, a passing mention in a political speech all became threads in the tapestry of his deception. He took care to mix accurate but harmless details with his invented intelligence, so that when the Germans checked his claims against reality, they often found just enough confirmation to reinforce their trust. Every successful message tightened the net he had cast around their confidence. John knew that timing was as important as content. He learned to send his intelligence at moments when the Germans were hungry for information, allowing them to believe they were receiving privileged insight into British strategy. At times he deliberately allowed small inaccuracies to slip through, knowing that when the truth eventually emerged, these apparent mistakes made his overall reports seem even more authentic. A perfect record might have raised suspicion. Occasional errors gave his network the texture of real life. What the Germans could not see was that these mistakes were as carefully crafted as every other part of his plan. In his imagination, the network grew larger and more complex. He spoke of loyal couriers traveling through the countryside, of a circle of agents who risked their lives to feed him the latest developments from inside Britain. Some of his fictional agents even disagreed with one another or provided conflicting accounts. A touch of realism that gave the Germans the impression they were handling the messy realities of human intelligence. June managed these invented disputes like a master dramatist, making his handlers feel that they were part of a living, breathing espionage operation. The more intricate the network became, the more convinced the Germans were that they had found one of their most valuable spies. Operating from Lisbon allowed John to maintain the illusion that he was inside Britain without ever setting foot there. His German handlers never doubted the elaborate stories he told about traveling back and forth, about his supposed English contacts and the secret codes he used to communicate with them. They were so convinced of his loyalty that they continued to provide him with funds to pay his phantom agents and to support his own work. In reality, the money meant to sustain a network of spies was used to sustain nothing more than Juan's unrelenting creativity. This remarkable deception carried enormous risk. if even one of his German contacts had grown suspicious or demanded proof beyond his carefully constructed reports, the entire operation could have collapsed and Juan's life would have been forfeit. Yet he maintained his composure with the confidence of someone who had survived the chaos of civil war and who now saw in this work a chance to strike a decisive blow against tyranny. Every message he sent was a calculated move in a larger game, a game in which he alone knew the rules. As his fictional network flourished, whispers of his effectiveness began to reach British intelligence. The man the Germans called Arable was becoming too influential to ignore, and the Allies soon realized that if they could bring him under their control, his deception could be turned into one of the most powerful weapons of the war. But at this stage of his journey, Juan Pujol García remained a solitary architect of illusion, crafting from the safety of Lisbon a spy ring that existed only on paper and in the minds of those desperate enough to believe. His network of shadows would not only fool the enemy, but also lay the groundwork for the grand deception that would one day help decide the fate of the D-Day invasion and the future of Europe itself. The intricate web of lies Juan Pujol García spun from Lisbon had grown so convincing that it eventually reached the ears of those he had always hoped to serve. In London, within the quiet offices of Britain's wartime intelligence service, MI5 analysts began to notice the curious reports being intercepted from a supposed German agent known by the codename Arable. The information carried in these messages was strangely accurate in its harmless details, and yet always seemed to stop just short of offering anything that could seriously compromise the Allied cause. For seasoned intelligence officers, such patterns were rarely the result of chance. Somewhere behind the neat German radio signals and the carefully phrased reports was a mind that understood the art of deception, and it was a mind they wanted to find. British agents traced the source back to the man in Lisbon, the Spaniard whose name had not yet become legendary. When MI5 finally approached Juan, they did so with the caution of men who understood how fragile trust could be in a world of double games. They tested him with questions designed to expose a pretender, watching for the slightest crack in his story. Juan, who had spent months living inside the character of Arable while secretly shaping his own private war against Nazism, answered each probe with a calm certainty that left no doubt about his true allegiance. He explained that his every move had been designed to undermine the very regime he pretended to serve, that his reports were carefully crafted to feed the Germans exactly what they wanted to believe, while protecting the Allied war effort. For the first time since he had conceived his bold plan, Juan felt the weight of recognition. The British understood his game, and more importantly, they approved. MI5 did not hesitate once they were convinced of his sincerity. They offered him what he had sought from the beginning, a chance to fight the Nazi regime, with the full support of the British intelligence network. But this time he would not simply be the self-appointed spy who had fooled Berlin from afar. He would become a fully sanctioned double agent, trained and guided by some of the most experienced operatives in the world. With his acceptance into their ranks came a new identity and a new name, one chosen to reflect the skill that had brought him this far. They called him Garbo, after the great actress Greta Garbo, whose ability to inhabit any role seemed the perfect tribute to a man who had turned deception into an art form. As Garbo, Juan stepped into a realm of espionage far more complex than anything he had yet attempted. No longer working alone, he now collaborated with British handlers who recognized both the brilliance of his existing network and the potential it held for future operations. Together they refined the fictional army of agents he had invented, giving each character new layers of credibility and crafting their communications with an even finer attention to detail. The British provided him with resources and technical support that allowed his deception to reach unprecedented levels of sophistication. From coded radio messages to carefully timed reports that would mislead the German high command, Juan thrived in this environment, for the partnership allowed him to turn his solitary mission into a coordinated campaign of strategic misdirection. His British colleagues marveled at his ability to think like his enemies while staying one step ahead of them. He knew instinctively how to blend fact and fiction so that the Germans would cling to his every word, convinced that their prized agent was delivering priceless intelligence. Under MI5's guidance, his reports became an essential part of the broader Allied plan to manipulate enemy expectations, shaping their understanding of troop movements and invasion strategies. The transformation from a self-taught spy into one of Britain's most trusted double agents did not come without risk. If the Germans ever suspected his true allegiance, their retribution would be swift and merciless. Yet John wore the danger as if it were a second skin. The years of turmoil he had endured during Spain's civil conflict had hardened him to fear, and his commitment to opposing tyranny burned brighter than ever. With each message he transmitted, he was not only deceiving the enemy but also helping to save lives by ensuring that Allied operations could proceed with an element of surprise. The codename Garbo became more than a mere label. It symbolized the perfection of his craft. Just as the actress for whom he was named could vanish into any role, John disappeared behind the many masks he had created. To the Germans, he remained Arable, the loyal agent whose network in Britain seemed to deliver intelligence of unmatched quality. To the British, he was their most valuable double agent, a man whose lies protected the truth and whose imagination would soon play a decisive role in the largest military operation of the war. Every report he sent, every careful piece of misinformation, carried the weight of entire armies and the fate of nations. For John, this new alliance with MI5 marked the moment when his personal mission merged fully with the global struggle. He had begun as a solitary man determined to defy the rise of tyranny, rejected by the very nation he hoped to aid, and forced to carve his own path into the clandestine world. Now, officially recognized and supported, he stood at the center of one of the most ambitious deception campaigns in history. The journey from an untrained Spaniard to the legendary Garbo was complete, and the greatest test of his ingenuity, the operation that would define his legacy, was just over the horizon. In the months that followed his recruitment, the man now known to MI5 as Garbo proved that patience and precision could become weapons every bit as potent as guns or bombs. Working from the relative quiet of Lisbon, he mastered the art of crafting reports that hovered delicately between fact and fiction, each message a carefully balanced blend of genuine information and subtle misdirection. To the untrained eye, his reports seemed unremarkable routine cables filled with logistical details, but hidden inside were signals of far greater consequence. Breadcrumbs that lured the German intelligence service toward a false sense of confidence. He understood that if every report were pure fabrication, suspicion would eventually bloom, so he salted his dispatches with enough accurate details to earn trust. When the Allies planned Operation Torch, the audacious invasion of North Africa, Garbo let slip just enough hints, fragmentary notes about troop movements and supply routes to suggest he had extraordinary access to Allied secrets, and his German handlers took the bait eagerly. Each successful transmission reinforced the illusion. German officers, long obsessed with staying one step ahead of the Allies, came to see him as a priceless source, someone whose insight reached into the very heart of British strategy. Garbo never rushed the process. He understood that credibility is built slowly, like a fortress, brick by brick, and once established it can shelter even the most daring of lies. His messages traveled through carefully arranged channels, encrypted and relayed until they landed on the desks of men who trusted him implicitly. Every time his intelligence coincided with small, verifiable events, a convoy's arrival, a minor troop deployment, his reputation deepened. It was not simply that he told them what they wished to hear. It was that he told them just enough truth to make every larger falsehood seem equally plausible. The delicate balance he maintained demanded a mind capable of inhabiting two realities at once. In one world he was the loyal servant of British intelligence, working in shadow with MI5 officers who fed him carefully chosen scraps of real information and guided the grand deception. In the other he was the devoted informant to the German Abwehr, seemingly risking his life to provide details from within the British Isles. To preserve this dual identity, he cultivated an almost theatrical sense of timing. He delayed certain messages just long enough that when the Germans received them they appeared to confirm events that had already occurred, lending an air of uncanny accuracy. Each delay, each half-truth, each artfully planted fact served a single, larger purpose: to make his eventual lies so convincing that when the Allies launched their most ambitious operations, the Germans would be looking in entirely the wrong direction. Operation Torch became the first major proof of concept. As Allied forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in late 1942, Garbo's earlier whispers of activity in the region seemed prophetic. German commanders, certain that their agent had once again delivered priceless intelligence, redoubled their faith in him. Yet every accurate fragment he sent had been carefully cleared by Mi-5, who understood that a little truth could mask far greater deceptions to come. With each successful ruse the stakes rose higher. What began as a single man's private determination to fight tyranny evolved into a carefully orchestrated dance of misinformation that would one day shape the outcome of the war itself. His growing legend among German operatives gave him a freedom few spies ever achieve. He could suggest troop buildups where none existed, hint at phantom divisions poised for action, and subtly steer the enemy's gaze toward places of the Allies' choosing. The Germans, lulled by the consistency of his past successes, never questioned the broader narrative he wove. Instead they treated his reports as gospel, feeding them up the chain of command where they influenced strategic decisions at the highest levels. For Garbo, every falsehood that found its way into the heart of enemy planning felt like another step toward victory, a silent blow struck not with weapons but with words. Behind the elegance of his deception lay long nights of calculation and an unshakable nerve. He lived in a constant tension, aware that a single misstep could expose him. Yet he thrived on that knife's edge, turning danger into discipline. His reports were not merely stories. They were meticulously engineered instruments of war, each sentence designed to guide German intelligence along a carefully predetermined path. And as the conflict deepened, the quiet man who once struggled to convince anyone of his worth now held the power to shape battles across continents. By winning the trust of those he opposed, Garbo transformed himself from an obscure volunteer into one of the most influential double agents of the Second World War, proving that in an age of armies and armadas, the sharpest victories could be won by a master of words and timing. By the spring of 1944, the quiet Spaniard who had once wandered through the corridors of British intelligence, hoping for a chance to contribute, had become the linchpin of one of the most daring deceptions of the war. Years of patient work had built a reputation so ironclad that German intelligence accepted his every word as unassailable truth. Known to them as an invaluable source who had accurately hinted at Operation Torch and other Allied moves, he now stood at the heart of a deception whose success would determine the fate of Europe. The Allies were preparing to launch the largest amphibious invasion in history, an operation so vast and complex that even a whisper of its real location could doom tens of thousands of soldiers. The plan was to strike at Normandy, but for the invasion to succeed the Germans had to be convinced the real attack would fall elsewhere. Garbo, with his meticulously crafted network of fictitious agents and his unmatched credibility, became the perfect instrument to bend the enemy's attention toward the wrong shore. Working closely with his Mi-5 handlers, he crafted an elaborate web of reports that painted a vivid picture of preparations for a massive assault at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. This location had long been a logical target in German calculations, and Garbo exploited that expectation with exquisite care. His network of imaginary sub-agents reported troop build-ups in southeastern England, the movement of phantom divisions, and the steady accumulation of landing craft, each detail carefully timed and confirmed by subtle signals that reinforced his reliability. He did not simply claim that the Allies intended to strike at Calais. He made the notion seem inevitable, a conclusion the Germans believed they had reached on their own. To strengthen the illusion, the Allies staged physical evidence dummy tanks, inflatable aircraft, false radio traffic, and Garbo's reports wove these deceptions into a coherent narrative that dazzled his German handlers. The art of his misdirection lay not in grand, sweeping statements but in a mosaic of small truths and plausible observations. He allowed the Germans to feel as though they were piecing together the puzzle themselves, offering just enough verifiable tidbits to make each larger fabrication appear authentic. His messages arrived with the same careful timing that had become his signature. Some were deliberately delayed, so that when they reached German command they seemed to confirm events already observed by other means, enhancing the sense that Garbo's network was uniquely accurate and extraordinarily well placed. This rhythm of reporting, never too fast to arouse suspicion, never too slow to lose credibility, created the perfect cadence for deceit. As D-Day approached, the tension grew almost unbearable. Garbo continued to send messages that reinforced the false narrative of a massive invasion force poised to cross at Calais. He even conveyed, at the last possible moment, a warning of the Normandy landings themselves, but timed it so that the message arrived too late to be of use. To the Germans, this seemed like proof of his extraordinary reliability. Here was an agent who had once again delivered crucial intelligence, delayed only by the chaos of war. They interpreted his slight tardiness not as evidence of trickery, but as a sign that even their best source could be hindered by the fog of conflict. Their confidence in him did not waver. If anything, it deepened. The effect was profound. Convinced that the Normandy assault was merely a feint and that the true invasion force would strike at Calais, the German High Command kept some of their most formidable units, the powerful panzer divisions, locked in place far from the actual beaches, where Allied soldiers were fighting for their lives. For days after the first landings, they hesitated to redeploy these forces, fearing that any movement would leave Calais vulnerable. This hesitation allowed the Allies to establish and expand their beachhead, turning the tide of the war in Western Europe. Historians would later argue that Garbo's carefully orchestrated deception saved countless lives and shortened the conflict. A victory achieved not through firepower, but through the patient manipulation of enemy perceptions. For Garbo himself, the success of this grand ruse was the culmination of years spent living a life of duplicity. He had begun as an obscure volunteer desperate to oppose tyranny, rejected by British intelligence and forced to prove his worth through his own ingenuity. From those uncertain beginnings, he had built a legend that spanned continents and shaped the course of history. Now, as German generals clung to the belief that Calais remained the true target, he understood that his quiet war of words had helped secure the greatest Allied victory of the age. His triumph was not marked by the roar of guns or the flash of artillery, but by the silence of German divisions waiting in the wrong place, while the fate of Europe shifted irrevocably on the beaches of Normandy. When the guns finally fell silent and Europe began the long process of rebuilding, Juan Pujol García, known to the Germans as the trusted Arable and to the British as the brilliant double Agent Garbo, slipped quietly into the shadows. He had achieved something few in history could claim. He was decorated by both sides of a brutal global conflict, receiving the German Iron Cross for his supposed loyalty and Britain's Member of the Order of the British Empire for his unparalleled service to the Allies. For a man who had spent years navigating a dangerous web of lies and truths, the end of the war was not merely a victory. It was a strange liberation. Yet, the peace he had helped secure also presented him with a question he had never had to face before. What life awaited a man whose entire existence had been defined by secrets and deception? Rather than bask in recognition or write memoirs of his daring exploits, Pujol chose the opposite path. He vanished. Official records were scarce. Whispers filled the void, and rumors grew that perhaps he had died or been silenced by former enemies. In reality, he crossed the Atlantic and began an anonymous life in Venezuela, where the heat of the tropics and the anonymity of a distant continent offered exactly the kind of quiet he craved. For decades he lived in near obscurity, his neighbors unaware that the unassuming man among them had once deceived the most formidable war machine the world had ever known. It was a life defined not by the adrenaline of espionage, but by the calm satisfaction of a mission completed and a war turned by wits rather than bullets. His disappearance became almost as legendary as his wartime feats. Historians search for him. Intelligence officers from the old days wondered whether their most extraordinary agent still walked the earth. Eventually, in the 1980s, researchers traced him to his modest home in Venezuela. When journalists and scholars finally met the man behind the myth, they found not a flamboyant hero hungry for fame, but a gentle, reflective figure who spoke more about the cost of war than his own heroics. He admitted to feeling no triumph in the deception itself, only a deep relief that his efforts had saved lives and hastened the end of a conflict that had consumed millions. For Pujol, recognition came not in medals or public acclaim, but in the knowledge that his quiet bravery had helped preserve the freedom of nations. Today his story endures as a reminder of the power of intellect, patience, and conviction. Juan Pujol García was not a soldier in the traditional sense. He carried no weapon and commanded no troops. Yet his courage and cunning shifted the balance of the Second World War. He proved that even in times of overwhelming violence, the subtle art of deception guided by a commitment to a greater good could change the course of history. His life is a testament to how ordinary individuals can rise to extraordinary challenges when driven by conscience and the will to resist tyranny. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the remarkable life of the man history remembers as Garbo. If this story of courage, cleverness, and quiet determination inspired you, please give this video a like and share it with friends who love untold history. And if you want to explore more incredible stories of hidden heroes and the pivotal moments they shaped, do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Your support helps us continue to bring to life the extraordinary tales of people who changed the world in ways few ever imagined.